Hi everyone, I'm going to walk you through the process for the student learning objectives, steps 3 and steps 4 that will need to be completed by November 15th. In Strive, then that will also need to be submitted to your T-test appraiser. So you're going to go into Strive, you're going to go into evaluations, and you will scroll down to your student learning objective. If you are a teacher that was with the district last year, you're going to see that you have more than one, because your prior year will also be in there, and we're actually going to look at both of these so that you guys can kind of see the progress over time and what the two different rubrics look like. So I'm actually going to look at this teacher's last year's rubric before anything else. You can see that this teacher has done step 1, and then she has also gone in and done step 2. So this next piece that we're going to talk about is step 3. One thing that is really challenging for a lot of people is to think about the student learning objective as having two completely separate rubrics. And so you've already written step 2, which is the initial skills profile. It's really helpful to think of it as the beginning of the year skills profile or the beginning of the year rubric. But what you need to do now is write this step 3, which is the end of the year skill profile or the targeted skill profile. One thing that I do show people a lot is something that I call the skills ladder, because it's helpful to think about these skills for students in terms of growth over time. You have already written this step 2, beginning of the year initial student skill profile, and you have written performance descriptors for well above typical, typical, below typical, well below typical. Now, this step 3, or this targeted skills profile for the end of the year, is what you're going to be doing now and going in and writing performance descriptors for those. So typical beginning of the year student is here, whereas a typical end of the year student is here. Because it is two different rubrics and the performance descriptors that you write in each rubric are different, it is completely appropriate for a student to be typical at beginning of the year and then end up as typical at the end of the year, because the descriptors for typical are different because they're coming from different rubrics. That is a challenge for a lot of people, because when they go to their student growth tracker and it says that a student went from typical to typical, it looks like they didn't grow, but in fact they did, because you're evaluating them against two completely different rubrics. What this looks like on here is you may have a kid that is the beginning of the year typical, and then you want them to be typical, or shoot for the moon, well above typical, whatever you choose, at the end of the year. And that would be appropriate growth, because it would be appropriate growth for a grade level over time. So going back to Strive, in step 3, she has gone in and written the descriptors for well above, typical, below typical, and well below typical. And one thing I wanted to point out that may be helpful to wrap your mind around it is the descriptor that she has for a end of the year student as a below typical student is, with moderate assistance, student is able to construct a somewhat adequate written response. So that is her step 3, or her end of the year skills profile, below typical student descriptor. But if you go up, that is also her descriptor for the beginning of the year typical student. So a typical student at the beginning of the year for this teacher, she has decided that with moderate assistance, the student is able to construct somewhat adequate written response. However, by the end of the year, after a year's worth of instruction, a student would be considered below typical if this was their performance level descriptor. So in essence, a lot of the work is already done for you, especially for the lower performance descriptors, but you're going to want to add some complexity to what your well above typical, above typical, and typical students can do, because hopefully after a year of instruction, what they can do is a lot more complex and a lot more aligned to at least the grade level standards, if not above. So this B piece is use data on your current students along with the description to establish a target for each individual student. So what this box is saying is, okay, now that I've written step 3, have I gone into my student growth tracker and I have looked at all of my students and made a target growth goal for them? once you do that, you can say yes. Then it says what evidence will you use to establish the student's skill level at the end of the interval. You're going to go ahead and fill out what piece of evidence you're going to use at the end of the interval. So for this teacher, she's doing a final Fulbright, which basically is a, for lack of a better word, a final timed essay that is unaided in any way to rank students at the end of the year. Then she's going to go in and do step 4, which is how will you differentiate instructions for groups, for students who are at the highest performing group as well as those that are in lowest performing group. What strategies will you use to monitor progress? And then describe your plan for conferencing with your colleagues about your progress. Once all of this is complete, you go ahead and press save, and then you will be done for steps 3 and 4 for your student learning objective.